Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Bible study this afternoon, this Thursday afternoon, here on, whatever device you are watching from, whenever you are watching. Good to be with you. We're continuing our journey through the Scriptures. We're into book number 2 in our Crossways series. We have a review video on the Book of Numbers from the Bible Project. So, without further delay or ado, let's jump into our video for today. Let me get it shared. Let me make sure the sound is coming out where I would like it to come out. And I'll push play. So, this is a review from last week.
The Book of Numbers. This fourth book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised Abraham. Now the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness. And immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the Promised Land. Now, you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion, and they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now, as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the Promised Land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and to lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol, but it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab. And the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp grumbling and rebelling, but up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness, that's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
All right. Any thoughts from the room here? Any questions? As always, I just love and appreciate the illustrations, the organized way that they put everything down and how they connect it to other portions of the Bible we've seen. You know, we've got this upper left-hand section that reminds us where we've come from. We got the upper right-hand section, which lets us know where it's going and kind of some of the main themes. I love the way they do these videos. And, excuse me, that brings us to today in our book for today. So let's get started on that. Let me share that to our projector, and let me share this to our internet audience as well. And away we go. Today we're finishing up the last book of the Torah, as it is understood, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And with that segue, I'll just jump right into pages 4 and 5 in our book for today. Those first 5 books of the Old Testament are referred to as the Pentateuch. And although tradition suggests that they were written by Moses, they contain no reference to Moses actually writing them. And that's not entirely accurate. There are a few places, like in Exodus, for example, where it is recorded that the events that were taking place were recorded, were written down. And I don't have those off the top of my head, but there is a moment where the Bible is being written as it is happening. But Moses is not necessarily the one who is the editor of these first 5 books, the one who brings them all together and gives them their finished, presented format. Exodus 19 reports Israel's arrival at Mount Sinai. Numbers 10 refers to their leaving Mount Sinai. And so the materials between these 2 passages focus on the events that took place at Mount Sinai. So the second part of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first part of the book of Numbers. The latter chapters of Numbers describe the Israelites destroying enemy nations on the east bank of the Jordan River, which is over here on this side, if you're looking at the map. So that's where the book of Numbers ends, as that video just laid out for us. And so one might expect the next book, Deuteronomy, that we're looking at today, to have them jump right into the next part, into the Promised Land and the conquering of the Promised Land. But it does not. Deuteronomy, instead, is a farewell speech. It is Moses preaching a final sermon to the Israelites who are getting ready, who are preparing to enter and take the possession of the Promised Land. And Moses' message is based on the themes of the Sinai covenant. So, as we take apart this illustration on page 4 of our second book here, let's start with this guy. Moses is delivering his final speech to the people in the book of Deuteronomy, and he has this on his mind. If you recall, this is the symbol for covenant that we learned about a few weeks ago, and it has all 6 elements of the covenant as it is typically found in the suzerain vassal covenant treaties of the day. And so he's basing his delivery to the people of Israel all on this covenant. Deuteronomy 1 and verses 1 and 5 state that Moses delivered this farewell exhortation beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. So they are right around here in this spot. They're getting ready to enter the Promised Land. So this illustration, it contains 2 different depictions of Mount Sinai. One of them is down here, where it geographically most likely is placed. But then there's another one that is kind of an echo of it, if you will, but it contains all the same elements. So why are there 2 of them? What's going on in this illustration? Well, all generations of Israelites were to understand themselves as having been there. And not just these people who are on the east bank of the Jordan River, but the people 100 years later who were trying to get set up, the people in King David's day who were enjoying life, the people who were in the Promised Land as it was deteriorating, and even the Jewish people still today. They have a way of understanding themselves as having been present at that location, at that time when God made this covenant with them. Although the Mount Sinai was located way down here in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, it was also in a real sense present wherever they were. It's kind of like it's right behind them. If they were to turn around, they'd see the imposing sight of Mount Sinai, along with the theophany going on at the top of it, with the clouds and the lightning, almost as like it's following them around, like they were present there. And I have a proposal. I have a proposed way of understanding this as something similar that we do today. We have one participant online with us now. We have one person here in the room. Have either of you ever been in Lincoln at Memorial Stadium in the fall on a Saturday afternoon? And where were you at? Were you down on the field or were you up in the stands?
Way up in the stands.
You were way up in the stands.
Nosebleed.
Yeah, the nosebleed section.
Yeah.
And I've been there too, but I've been up in the stands. I've not been down on the field participating in the actual football game. But at the same time, after the game is done, I will say, along with everybody who was there, we won or we lost. Now, how can I say such a thing? Well, because that's just not true, or is it? The whole community up there in the stands, all 91,000 some of them, can say that together because they are a part of something bigger than themselves. They are a community in that way. And they did, in a way, participate in what went on down there on the field. Now, it's not perfect, and I think this Israelite understanding is a little bit more literal than that, but it's a taste of what that understanding is all about. So, yep, there's the theophany, the covenant, and the tabernacle that all happened at Mount Sinai. So the central themes in Deuteronomy are, we'll give an overview and then we'll kind of pick apart some of the structure, but a lot of that will be talked about in the video next week as we review, so we'll get it twice. The central theme, first of all, is the land. We have this question mark above the land of Canaan, as that is one of the major themes that is repeated all throughout the book of Deuteronomy. It's what is at stake as they are about to enter this land and possess it, and what do they do to maintain their presence there? Moses reminds the people that the land remains God's property. God merely grants the Israelites the right to rent it, to dwell within it as tenants. The people are not to presume that they will live in the land forever. They will remain in the land only as long as they remain faithful to the covenant that God made with them back at Mount Sinai. If they treat the covenant lightly and break it persistently, they will lose the land. That has already been established as line number 6 in the covenant, but here, line number 6 grows to a very unequal proportionate size compared to the rest of these items. It's like this is what Deuteronomy is concerned about first and foremost. Also, along with the land, something they do to remain in the land is keep the Lord alone as the God that they worship. Shun all false worship. God demands that they destroy all pagans and their shrines to eliminate all temptations to idolatry. If you remember the last slide from last week, we talked about the Canaanite Baal worship and the whole fertility cult system that went on. And we already know, spoiler alert, we already know that they fail miserably at this. But it's not for lack of understanding it. It's not for lack of God letting them know what the expectations were. One sanctuary. Worship one God, but also worship that one God in one place, one geographic location. Now, this is a bit of a change. The Genesis narrative refers to the presence of a number of different altars, and they're noted there in chapter 12, 22, 26, 33, 35 in Genesis, and also in Exodus chapter 20. So there's all these different places where God meets his people, whether that be Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Moses, all different kinds of places. But now, Deuteronomy stresses one God and one altar. It rejects the notion of God dwelling materially in any building made by human hands and insists that only God's name dwells in such structures. The underlying concern is that it is easier to maintain proper worship practices and loyalty to God when there's only one place of worship, but it's more difficult when there are many. If everyone has one in their backyard, how are we going to maintain a consistent messaging factor as people are traveling through this stretch of land to get through the trade routes? The priority is for them to have a unified presentation instead of local ones with all different emphases and priorities and all that. Does that make sense? Is that kind of... Yeah, it fits with the whole point of God making this covenant. Now, Deuteronomy does not say where that has to be. And at this point, Jerusalem is not yet the capital. The Ark of the Covenant comes to rest at a shrine in Shiloh, which is right around there. But the stage is set for the importance of having one God in one place. The blessings and curses we've already kind of talked about as a part of living in the land. If they do this, they'll be blessed. If they don't, they'll be out. And Moses says to the people, I'm putting before you life and death, blessings and curses. So for God's sake, choose life. It's right here in front of you. Make the right choice, even though I know you're not going to do that. Thoughts on this? Here is your outline illustration for the book of Deuteronomy. All right, I'll leave this up as we progress further through our book for today. And again, the videos do a wonderful job of showing the outline, the structure. So I'm not going to list or read off all of the different categories, all the different chapters, if you will, in the book of Deuteronomy, but that's on page 7, if you'd like to take a quick look through that. And on page 8. On page 9, number 1 and number 2 there are actually a repeat from our first page, so I'm not going to read through those again. Number 3 is interesting, though. Although there is considerable overlap between Deuteronomy and the writings that precede it, in other words, Deuteronomy has a lot of review. We have arrived here in the place beyond the Jordan, east of the Jordan, but Moses kind of stops and says, here's what happened last time. It gives one of those where it brings you up to speed. Last time on our show, and it gives you a review. But it doesn't mesh well with the actual books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. But it does serve as a meaningful introduction to what follows in Joshua through 2 Kings. Deuteronomic expressions, themes, and emphases recur throughout these writings and often constitute the framework for the narrative materials they contain. Deuteronomy's central themes have influenced the contents of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And so, it is widely believed that these different layouts, the Genesis through Numbers, and then the Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, are two different groups of assembled materials. They come from two different sources that were compiled at two different points in time. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that's something that seems like a natural thing, because these stories, these testimonies were being brought down over time. And you get to a point, maybe while the kings were in power, where you'd need to actually solidify what the story is to this point, to gather all of our information, all of our materials, and just have one version of it, the definitive version, if you will. And so that happened in Genesis through Numbers. But then there comes a point where you need to do it again. And that leads us to believe that Deuteronomy through 2 Kings is another such moment, where all of these source materials were compiled together and the definitive version was laid down. That one, there's strong evidence to suggest when that moment happened, and it was while the people were in exile in Babylon. So there's a lot of significance, a lot of meaning that pops out if you understand that what Moses is saying to the people here on the borders of the Promised Land and how he is saying, here's what you do to avoid any kind of exodus from or ejection from the promised land. And it's being read to a people who had been ejected from the promised land. In the bottom paragraph there, the next time that this event happens, where these source materials were compiled together, we have another moment where 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah are understood to be the chronicler's history. What happened to the people after they came back from exile in Babylon, rather. So that's a journey into the meta of the Bible. What is actually inside? What makes it tick? What is what is? Questions on that? Thoughts on that? All right, on page 10. The covenant structure of Deuteronomy is reviewed. In our illustration anyway, the tablet that Moses is holding, as it is superimposed over what would be the Mediterranean Sea there, it's the same covenant. It's the same one that we are familiar with from the book of Exodus. And so it's the same pattern. That's what number 1 and number 2 there are talking about. Number 3, Deuteronomy reads like an aging father's final advice to his children. Its characteristics are obvious, and much of its vocabulary is distinctive, and these features stand out even in our English translations. There's a warmth, a zeal, and an urgency of spirit that weaves its way through 2 foundational truths. Those 2 foundational truths are God has been good to you. God has done all of these things for you, brought you out of slavery, made a covenant agreement with you at Sinai, and has led you to this point. And be there, God wants you to respond in kind, according to the model that God has set forth. Be obedient to God, follow God's commands, his statutes, his ordinances, and things will be good. Things will go well. There are other farewell speeches that occur in the Bible, in Jacob, Joshua, Samuel, David, and Jesus as well. Hello. It's Craig Wallenberg.
I told you we got a voice message for you.
Okay.
They had to take a little more out than they thought.
Hold on 1 second. I'm just going to pause our... Hello again. Sorry for that pause in our time. We're almost to the end of our book anyway here. The end of our unit for today. The style is the last page, page 11. And you can see a pattern that really emerges. That's based on this, this urgency. The following passages convey the spirit of some of the expressions that occur repeatedly, not only in Deuteronomy, but they're reflected in numerous statements and phrases in what follows, in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, to further lend evidence towards these being one compiled group. Phrases such as, these are the decrees, statutes, and ordinances. You must observe them diligently, must study and teach them to your children. With all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, walk in God's ways. Do not forget the Lord your God. Do what is right. You get the idea. There's an urgency that is laid down here, almost as if they're trying to get the people to pay attention before it's too late. And that's Deuteronomy. Next week, we start talking about what happens after they do cross into the promised land on this side of the Jordan River. Question? Yes, Joe.
The very last line, you shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left.
Mm-hmm.
What was that referring to?
That's kind of an expression that you'll see repeated throughout this section. And the first time that we kind of see that the right hand or the left hand is when the people are crossing through the Red Sea, with the wall of water on the right and the wall of water on the left. And they're going to go straight through, following the path that God has laid out for them. And it was one time the idea was suggested to me, and I really like it, that this idea going to the right or to the left is going to lead you into trouble. You've got this wall of water on your right, this wall of water on your left. So it's kind of borrowing that imagery when that expression is used. Does that kind of make sense? I like to think about that too.
Because today it's all political.
Oh boy.
That's where I just thought.
Yep. Yeah, the right extremism, the left extremism. Yeah, that takes on all new meaning and frustrating significance for us today. But that is what I believe they are trying to convey when that happens. Any other questions? Thoughts? All right. Well, one more question.
Frame. From the time they left Egypt, a year at Sinai, and then 40 years in the wilderness. So we're talking 42 or 3 years.
Yeah, more about 41, because it takes 40 days traditionally from the crossing of the Red Sea for them to get to Mount Sinai. And then, 1 year at Mount Sinai, altogether about 41 years, I would say. Whether that is literally, the calendar, or whether 40 is more of a, symbolic number. I'll just remind us that, numbers in the Bible are sometimes not literal accounting. They're more symbolic. But yeah, it's often said 40 years in the wilderness, and who are we to say otherwise? Yep. Other questions? All right then. I will thank you for sharing our time here, for those who are on YouTube later on. And we'll see our YouTube